Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Azlina Bulmer. I'm the director of RIBA International and I'm delighted to be here today with you to discuss the way ahead and to hear your views on the delivery of this framework. The way ahead sets out RIBA's framework for the future of architectural education and professional development to strengthen the profession and ensure that it remains relevant and continues to lead in design and construction. The RIBA International Directorate was established just under 2 years ago with the aim of supporting and expanding our international network. We have gone from strength to strength and we've launched an exciting and varied program to engage and support our international architecture community and represent the interests of international members, no matter where they are in the world. We also opened our first international offices in Shanghai, China, and also in Gulf in December 2019. We have 6 international chapter member groups, including the Gulf chapter, which is one of the most active and oldest, having celebrated its 10th anniversary only last year. As a leading global voice for architecture, we collaborate with international institutes of architects such as the Africa Union of Architects, AUA, to promote design excellence and create greater social mobility within the profession. RIBA is also a member of other institutes, including the Architects Council of Europe, the International Union of Architects, as well as the Commonwealth Union of Architects. To give a little context in terms of membership, we have around 7,000 members internationally. In the Middle East and Africa region, we have around just under 1,200 members. With 700, roughly around 700 in UAE and Gulf, and another 100 in South Africa. There are 5 RIBA validated schools in the region, in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and 3 in Egypt, giving a prospect student membership pool of around 2,000. Middle East and Africa, I don't need to tell any of you this, of course, is a very large, diverse and culturally rich region. It is an important region for RIBA, being an area of strategic priority for us and one with huge potential both economically and for RIBA membership. RIBA's Gulf office operates out of Sharjah in UAE and delivers a program to engage and support our members and key partners organization. We have significant plans for 2021, including participation in the World Expo in Dubai later in 2021, in October, I believe. We recently signed an agreement with the American University of Dubai to host joint programs for the architecture community in UAE. And in 2019, we agreed a 5-year memorandum of understanding with Dubai Land Department. The agreement involves collaboration on areas including professional standards and support, as well as opportunities for architects working in Dubai. In Africa, Ghana is an area of particular focus for us in 2021, with the RIBA Royal Gold Medal being awarded to Sir David Adjaye and the Annie Spink Award for Education going to Professor Leslie Loko, both of whom are based in Africa. The RIBA Council member for Middle East and Africa is Alice Asafu Adjaye, who is based in Africa. She has been practicing in Ghana since 2012, where she was instrumental in the launching of Adjaye Associates as Associate Director of African Projects before founding her own studio of talented architects in 2016. Unfortunately, although it's fortunate for Alice, she's unable to join us today because she's at a festival. But we will be sending out a statement from her to all attendees at the end of this event. So just a slight change to the programme as advertised, we're going to shortly move straight to RIBA President Professor Alan Jones, who will talk about the Way Ahead framework and the proposed plans for its delivery. We are, of course, here very keen to hear from you because this is a two-way conversation. So please have some ready for the Q&A after this presentation. For now, I'm going to hand over to the President. Over to you, Professor Alan Jones.
Thank you very much, Azlina. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you all. I'm going to immediately share my screen with you. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see my screen. And I'm going to take about 25 minutes and then we will have lots of time for a conversation as how best to implement the way ahead. But it's to give some context to the document and the direction of travel. And I believe it is really about, as I say here in my title, designing the future of the architect's profession. And so thank you very much for registering for this event and for your interest in the future of our profession. The Way Ahead document was published last year, August 2020. And if you're at your computer, you could, or iPad, you could Google RIBA Way Ahead. I must admit, that's the way I find it. It's easier than trying to troll through the RIBA website, and you can find it there as a downloadable PDF. This is one of the main photographs I used when I was campaigning to be president of the RIBA, and very much my manifesto was about opportunity for everyone, both into and upwards through our profession. So through education and access to the profession, and a focus on competence and excellence. And I'm speaking to you from Northern Ireland, the home of the Titanic, the ill-fated Titanic. Many episodes and parts of the Games of Thrones was filmed here. A fantastic combination of landscape. This is the north coast of Northern Ireland and our towns and cities, and it's a combination of that with industry and history, obviously some of which is not so positive with our troubles that have now, if you like, are well behind us. It's also the home of strong accents, so hopefully I will speak slowly and clearly so everybody can understand me. This is the benefit or one of the downsides, I suppose, of being in Northern Ireland for so long with COVID, that it's very much a strong accent, but I will speak slowly. So, as being president, I have not travelled very much in my time, but I can advise you that I have been to Alexandria, to Cairo, to Dubai, and to Mombasa. All part of the Middle East and African region of the RIBA. But I think also COVID has had an impact on education. And in some ways it has liberalized it and made it easier for people. But equally, I think it has its downsides in terms of university and peer support, and also moving into the workplace. Just yesterday, I attended the Practice and Profession Committee of the RIBA, and there was talk about how students and graduates could actually join in meetings with clients and so on because of so much being done online. So it is a mixed bag of good and not so good. In my first few months of being president, I got council approval to start a group called the President's Fact-Finding Mission about where do we want to be where by 2034, and what does it mean to be a contemporary professional and a contemporary profession. I have 8 champions. One of them is pictured here. It's Indy Johar, who co-founder of Dark Matter Laboratories in London. And I was just listening this week to one of his contributors. Each champion has 6 contributors. And Sir Jeff Mulgan of UCL, he described that every profession, to have some autonomy, comes in exchange for it being able to demonstrate its ethics, its ability to self-police, and its public value. And repeatedly, those get out of alignment. So it's absolutely right, says Jeff Mulgan, that every profession must repeatedly return to that explicit and implicit social contract, its value, its ethics, and its ability to self-police, which I think is very, very timely for where we find our profession right now. My first week as president, I chaired the Royal Gold Medal panel for it was in 2019, but for the 2020 gold medal. And I was pleased that the gold medal went to a practice, to Grafton Architects. not to the two individuals, the two women who started it. They were adamant that they wanted the gold medal to go to a practice. And it gave a very strong message that creating architecture and being an architect is a team effort. And if they were listening to the speech or this event, they would be absolutely agreeing that the architect's profession must return to that explicit and implicit social contract. That's exactly what their work is about. It's about how, through the work that they do and the projects that they create, how it improves how people study, how they live, how they work. Equally, I was very pleased to be part of the shortlisting and the judging for the 2019 Stirling Prize. The outcome of that was the winner in the UK was the Goldsmith Street housing project in Norwich, which is 100% social housing, a low energy passive house standard, and it really has helped people in terms of their health, their attendance at school, at work, their ability to not have to make decisions about, for example, do they heat or eat? There are safe play areas, the use of passive sort of site planning to maximize solar gain, for example, and reduce heating. The jury agreed that in awarding this award, the gold medal to this scheme, that maybe in 10 years, that this would be the standard for housing in the UK and not something that was seen as unusual, to the point where in 10 years' time, a project like this would not win even an RIBA award. It should just be seen as standard. But the gold medal and the Stirling Prize are an indication of a direction of travel, as is the judging. I chaired the judging again last year for the 2021 gold medal, and that went to Sir David Adjaye. And I have to admit that I had to do my homework and buy some of add some books to my library to write the citation because he was, and his practice, if you like, wasn't completely on my radar. He was, when he was based more in London, I would describe him as an outsider to the standard practice scene in London and the UK, but he found his way and he found a different way of practicing. And again, I would argue that that result of that award going to David Adjaye, I'm looking forward to presenting it to him. It might be in London, it might be in Accra. Again, it resonates with that idea of the profession returning to that explicit and implicit social contract. The second day, the first day of my presidency was a Sunday. So 2nd of September, this book was published, Defining Contemporary Professionalism for Architects in Practice and Education, edited by myself and Rob Hyde, and are in the UK, the chair and the chief exec of the Architects Registration Board said, Alan, how timely, a book on professionalism. And again, that indicates a direction of travel. We have been working in the RIBA on a rebranding of the RIBA for 2 years. Not all of us doing it for 2 years, but over a team and a body of people and consultants and so on. But don't think of it as choosing another shade of red or choosing a different font. To me, it's much more fundamental, and it will be rolled out this year. It is a reorientation of the value of architecture and architects. Instead of us being accused of being inward looking and patting each other on the back, what this does is actually explain to everybody the value of what we do to the broader public, to society, and to the world. So, for example, this project is one of Erno Goldfinger's projects in London. Yes, it is brutalist architecture, but actually it's so much more. It's a manifestation of construction and technology, development and planning policy, health and well-being attitudes to that, ecology, regulation, social policy. So it's not just a piece of architecture, it's about what it does, what does it achieve, how does it perform. And again, I believe it resonates very strongly with Jeff Mulligan's proposal that the profession must repeatedly return to that explicit and implicit social contract. Yes, we are here to serve society and the world. So the way ahead, the future of the architect's profession. There is a direction of travel. I've given you some, if you like, nuggets of that through the last 2 years. Obviously, there are other major events. When I started my first council meeting, I explained, I made a proposal, and this was actually published in the RIBA journal, and it was actually used to describe to the post-Grenfell fire panel, the Industry Safety Steering Group in London, an indication of a change of culture. And I'm going to read it to you. In early October 2019, within an hour of chairing my first RIBA council meeting, I asked for a vote on the preparedness of chartered and future architects as individuals and practices to take the high road of greater evidencing of competency, managing potential higher levels of risk, accepting greater responsibility, and increasing expertise en route to potentially greater value, higher fees, and positive impact, knowing that to do so will have major implications for the education of future architects and the continuing professional development of chartered architects and how they practice. Everyone, including student and international representatives, voted to take the high road. So in a way, that was, if you like, the invitation for the way ahead to be created. And I think we need to look at other professions. What is it to be, what is a contemporary profession? In terms of doctors, we have paramedics, we have general practitioners or GPs, we have specialists and consultants, lawyers, we have paralegals, we have solicitors, we have specialists, and we have barristers. But when we come to architects, where are we in terms of that idea of different people who would maybe support and take over certain roles? The general practitioner, the specialist, the extreme specialist, the consultant, and the equivalent of the barrister. And that's something that the way ahead starts to consider. There have been reports of the death of professions or the minimizing of professions. I could ask you, if when you become ill, do you Google your symptoms to find out what's wrong with you? Even doctors refer to Dr. Google. The Suskins, the father and son team, in their book, The Future of the Professions, they suggested the issues around AI and digital would minimize professions. But Tom Nicol, in The Death of Expertise, he actually talked about, in his conclusion, he couldn't see a way out except if there was a disaster. And we have, as architects, we have our disasters. We have climate emergency. We have the crisis of biodiversity. In the UK, we've had Grenfell. I'm sure in your countries you've had similar issues around public safety and fire safety. We all have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, spatial and environmental equality, and more. So our profession needs to attain and demonstrate competencies that the world and society expects and needs now and into the future. Society, users, clients and governments need architects to help deliver outcomes for the good of everyone, everywhere. So whether we're designing and helping to deliver a project, be that in Baltimore, Belfast, Beirut, Bangladesh, wherever, the impact of what we do, wherever we are, has spreads across the world. So we have to consider education. We have an education through the RIBA, through validation, to consider and deliver from the start to the end of a project, from inception to occupation, delivering and determining performance and ensuring that it was maintained all the way from the start of a project, through design, through construction, through to use. So change is due and change is here. The Way Ahead was published, as I said, in August of last year. And it is a proposed framework. The document was issued for consultation, and there are a series of workshops that are happening within the UK, but there are also a series of international workshops, and this is the first one. So we are very, very interested to hear what you have to say and how you reflect on how we could implement it. The three main strands of the Way Ahead. It is a single career long standard. This idea of you are educated, you become an architect and that's it, has gone. It brings together the idea of it's a single trajectory from starting to study architecture, that initial qualification and registration, through early years of practice, mid-career, end career, retirement, and I would like to think on how you then feed back into the supporting those on the beginning of their journey. But it's seen as a single career long standard. There are education themes and values for part 1 and part 2 study, and those tie back much more closely to practice and really start to connect education and practice together. There can be conversations about actually how does that I try to avoid the term training, because obviously we're doing more than training. We're trying to build and develop behaviors and ethics that last the full length of an architect's career. There's also the third one is mandatory competencies, what you must show that you know. So the Way Ahead is a proposed framework created with input from expert committees and discussion with RIBA. But how do you think it should be implemented? We're asking across the world, we're asking across the UK, because we realise that there are subtle differences. Even within the UK, we have different sets of regulations. So we can't have one way of delivering and implementing the Way Ahead. We have devolved governments in the UK. And as Lena was pointing out, the Middle East and African region is so large. How do we actually work with such diversity and differences? I believe there are core knowledge and skills and behaviours of an architect. Wherever you are in terms of principles and ethics, they should all be of the same high standard. But there's also the specific too. Regulations, standards, contracts, and the roles of architects change and are different. So the Way Ahead, published in 2020, and as it states, practice and academia coming together to challenge and support each other. That's a direct quote from my manifesto. It is a continual journey of learning and development. It is a consultation document. You can download it at architecture.com. And it states the way ahead outlines the RIBA's new education and professional development, that idea of the single journey. It signifies a new direction for architectural education and continuing professional development, with greater emphasis on health and safety, like climate emergency and professional ethics, so that it really starts to change the direction of architectural education, and obviously that needs to be supported. And I'm quoted as saying, a sharpened focus on core knowledge, skills and experience required to respond to the immediate and mid-term challenges facing our world, society and industry. And our Vice President for Education, Nikki Watson, placed primacy on health and safety, health and life safety, climate literacy and ethical practice, as well as both technical and business skills as key components of architectural education. And Miriam from, I think she's based in Dubai, but actually studying in Manchester, ethics, health, life, safety and sustainable design are not just abstract regulatory concepts, but real world issues that students care about. The next generation of students have the ambition, ability and drive to tackle issues facing society. Therefore, it is important to support these aspirations with an improved education curriculum. There will be resources for RIBA members, student, graduate and chartered members. There will be books and online documents. RIBA Academy, that's just over a year old, there are already 500 hours of video. RIBA Academy will also support RIBA validated schools of architecture. And there will be, I've been assured that RIBA CPD material for mandatory competencies will be free to RIBA members. The way ahead, really, I could summarize it, is that it helps facilitate us helping to deliver the impact that we all wish for, making our world a better place. So thank you for the invitation to talk to you. I'm interested in your reflections, your comments and questions. How can we best implement the way ahead for you, your practice, your university? You could email us as well as ask questions today on info@riba.org. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point in time.
Thank you, Alan. That's a really informative session there. It really does give us a good base of some of the questions that have already come in. And again, to our listeners, our audience, today is really about consulting you out there on this particular topic. And I'm just going to go through a couple of questions. And before we do so, just please keep typing in and we will publish the questions as we go along. Before we start, Alan, if you could just remind our audience, if there's one thing you could change about the profession, how the profession operate over the next 5 years, what would that be?
Well, my immediate thought is, well, the world in terms of climate literacy and our impact on it, that has to be the most important thing. We have to challenge clients, governments, ourselves about demolishing buildings. And the most sustainable building is one that already exists, one would argue. And that is if we could focus our efforts on that. I think what's interesting, the RIBA has the 2030 climate challenge, but the introduction of these competencies in climate literacy, for example, mean that it's not optional anymore, that actually I think the engagement with that challenge will increase significantly when we have when those competencies start to kick in.
Thank you. So the first question from our audience is from Anonymous. Software architect is a confusing expropriation of the title. Should the term architect be scrapped in favour of a less pompous building designer?
Sorry, that's a yoga sign, by the way, guys. It's just like just be calm, okay? Because I could get very emotive, because that raises a whole series of issues. For example, in the UK, we currently have protection of title. Yeah. And what this really starts to, and I appreciate the legislation, and we're talking to an audience from such a wide variety of countries. There will be different forms of protection, if any. There's a debate going on within the UK at the minute about the difference between protection of title, which really is very difficult. And I get the way the architect, your point or question about software architect, it's the same with naval architect. A little bit closer is when somebody talks about being an interior architect, which we really stamp on. But the Architects Registration Board approach is, well, if it's quite clearly not related to buildings, then that's fine for that term to be used. I must admit, as an architect that spent a lot of time becoming an architect, and a lot of effort and a lot of money, the idea of actually just even somebody saying, "Oh, he was the architect of the idea," I'm immediately going, "Oh no, you can't do that. No, you shouldn't even be using it for that." But it's a broad term. Where the discussion is going is that there are quite a number of G7, G8 countries, EU countries, where there is protection or regulation of function, so that it's quite clear that other governments, other societies have realized that actually you have to have certain people with certain qualifications doing certain things. And that's not to say that it's always just an architect that does it, but actually for the protection of society, I think we do need to have regulation of function. And I think I must admit, I'm firmly wedded to the term architect. I don't particularly like the term architectural profession, for example. I would refer to it as the architect's profession, architect's apostrophe profession. And the same, I think we have let our boundaries be blurred. I think yes, we can be cross-disciplinary and we can work within teams, but we need to be very clear about what we can do and how well we can do it. And that, again, in a way ties back to the direction of travel with the way ahead.
Thank you, that's really useful. I know this question has actually been answered by my colleague in Sharjah, but I'd quite like to hear your views on this, Alan. A number of design professionals in the region, particularly in Gulf, are in fact engineers as opposed to architects. And so the question is, are such delegates able to attend and benefit from RIBA events as well? I mean, the direct answer from RIBA, yes, of course, wherever relevant, we welcome that. But as you may know, Alan, the majority of those working in the Gulf region are engineers. Because of how it works, they don't have an Institute of Architecture like we do. They don't have the same structure. What are your views about multidisciplinary and how they work together for the benefit of advancing architecture?
Well, even put up the slide about Grafton Architects. Yeah. Projects are so complex now that really to deliver them, it is a team effort, and that's not just within an architect's office. That's working with engineers, working with cost consultants, working with landscape architects, planners, all sorts of different building industry professionals. For example, I spent 8 years working with Michael Hopkins and partners, as they were called then, now called Hopkins Architects. And we were, even at the point of a competition, the first thing you did in our case was we generally phoned Arabs, and I shouldn't be sponsoring Arabs, but phoning the engineers and having a conversation with engineers right at the start of a project. So to me, it's very, but it's very clear as to what architects do, what engineers do. You know, and again, we've got, I'm sure it's the same across the region, issues around professional indemnity insurance. And one of the risks, one of the problems there, and one of the main areas of claims over and above, obviously, all the concerns about fire and materials at the minute, has been architects doing more than they were supposed to do. So I think it's for us to understand our remit and what we do, and especially those entering the profession in their early years, to understand what we do and what we can do well. I think it is important.
Thank you for that, Alan. Question from Anonymous. Do you accept that the mitigation of the climate change crisis is ethical, not technical, as Joseph Reichert, Bruno Latour and Rowan Williams insist?
I think it's both. I think it's we can have ethical discussions about climate emergency, but actually the resolution of it is technical, and that again is why within the way ahead there is a push towards technical skills. I'm going to say, we're not talking in the UK, and nobody from the UK is listening. My experience, particularly of UK education, is that it has become, because it has lost a level of funding and it's now set down at the same level as geography, it has become perhaps overly humanities based and less technical. It dropped about 15, 20 years ago from technical level, same as engineering, down to almost semi humanities. So it's there with geography and maths. And really it needs to get back up to technical, which is an issue that we're going through with the UK government at the minute. So I think it is both. I think one can't be technical without being ethical, and I think you can't be ethical without thinking technical. Sorry for sitting on the fence.
Thank you. A question from Anonymous. How can, this is more about RIBA and our membership, how can the RIBA provide value for money for architects who are practicing in Africa without an office to support members?
Well, interestingly, I asked the question internally, and I'm not sure if I got an answer ahead of the presentation, because I anticipated this question coming up. And I sort of said, well, at the moment in the UK, there's a hardship threshold, so that if you earn less than £20,000 in the UK, you can apply for a lesser membership fee. And I made the point in the sort of warm up to our preliminary meeting about for this meeting, and I said, well, if if the RIBA membership fee is the same across the world, shouldn't the 20,000 threshold also be applied across the world? So if you're sitting in, and I even refer to Northern Ireland being a low-cost economy. So if you sat within a low-cost economy and were earning less than 20,000, should you be putting a form into the RIBA for a lower membership fee? I think one of my slides was about COVID, and I think what that has done has accelerated a whole series of different aspects of our professional lives, but also the provision that is given by the RIBA. So, for example, I mentioned RIBA Academy. That was accelerated, in my opinion, because of COVID. So you find that there's much more online. So wherever you are, and it reduces, for example, the need to purchase books. I'd like to think that anything that is connected back to the mandatory competencies that are mentioned in the way ahead is actually available online, that you don't have to buy books. It was pointed out to me last week, for example, the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge refers to a book that you have to buy, and you have to spend almost £100 buying it. And for small practices on their own, even in the UK, £100 is a lot. And so we have to be very aware of the circumstances, practice-wise and financially wise, of our members.
Thank you, Alan. Just to confirm to the audience as well, we do have a number of different rates if we're talking about the cost itself, which is retired rate, our reduced rate and our hardship rate. Please do get in touch with the membership team or myself, and we'll support you in any way we can.
I think that's really helpful, Aslina. Because the hardship, that sort of threshold of 20,000, you know, I'm sure there are regions within the MEA where that would be a reasonable salary for an architect in you know in the context of the economic context. So I would encourage people to get the form and fill it out. You know? Yeah,
and please just come to us. We will absolutely support you through this. Another question from Anonymous. It's about climate emergency, Alan. Could you touch on what the RIBA is doing for the climate emergency?
Well, I mentioned, well, I've already mentioned, but I'll mention it because there's a series of things. There is the 2030 challenge that was brought out probably, it feels like about 2 years ago. But I made the point, there was a board meeting yesterday, and I made it was reported that there were 203 practices have taken up the climate challenge. We have 4,000 practices in the RIBA. And so that shows that there is a limited uptake. And I think we have to really help our practices understand, you know, engage with climate emergency more. So hence the way ahead, where those, and we agreed at Council in December, the climate literacy knowledge schedule, and that will then feed through to mandatory competencies for climate literacy. And then I think we'll start to see that engagement with the climate challenge will increase. I think we need to, for example, that book that I mentioned, it was almost £100. Can we put that online? I think we have to support our members as much as we can. RIBA Academy, for example, will have lots of information and on the skills and approaches necessary to address it. It's interesting that since it's gone behind the paywall, so if you're a member of the RIBA, be that student or chartered, you can, the amount of access that has happened since all of that has been put behind the paywall has increased. So it's, which I think is very, very significant. RIBA Publishing have created, I know there's the new book that, being edited or co-authored by Sophie Pelsmakers. That's over and on top of her original book, which is really, really good as well at helping people understand. We're gearing up for COP26, actually is in Glasgow this year, and the UK is realising that they have to, because it's located there, they're having to really demonstrate their commitment to climate emergency, and we're heavily involved with discussions about how that is represented in terms of the built environment at COP26. Globally, I think we align very closely with the UIA, with the AIA to find ways to put to help and support architects. But again, that's part of what the way ahead is about as well, is that members have to become more aware of and more skilled in terms of addressing climate emergency. And that's part of, in inverted commas, why we're here, why we're talking about the way ahead, because it really, we have to upskill. And the most, as I said before, the most important area is climate emergency.
Yeah, and of course, Alan, you hosted international presidents last year on this subject before we went into lockdown, and that includes the president of the African Union of Architects as well. So the global level that we do talk. And this is another a question from Anonymous, and it's quite an emotive one because it is about Grenfell, and I know RIBA takes a very, has done quite a lot of work on this. And the question is about, the responsibility and disciplinary. They talk about paramedics, not lawyers, burned down Grenfell, a housing block with the loss of lives. What are RIBA looking at in terms of disciplinary proceedings to relevant architects that were involved in this, if they were?
what we're going to do, we were talking about this at board level yesterday, and we will wait for the inquiry to finish, and then we will decide what we do. I think it would be premature to do anything until then. So but what we are doing, for example, is also we're making sure that we review any connections that we have with any manufacturers of any of the materials that were involved with Grenfell, that we get arm's distance between us and them as well. So we need to, we're reviewing that, for example, insulation providers, panel providers, all of that. We're making sure that we're not involved with those suppliers going forward.
Thank you, Alan. And this is just a comment. The RIBA's Road to Recovery podcast has been a great source of learning during this difficult time. Fabulous. Next question, I think my colleague has answered. So this is an interesting one about membership as well. There are 18 RIBA members in Kenya, about 15,000 AAK members. The RIBA won't support the Kenyan architects by recognising that academic qualification. So this is MRPQ really. Is that something there for RIBA to do?
Interestingly, I was involved with a Nigerian Institute of Architects event. I think it was either just before Christmas or just after Christmas. And we were discussing this issue of recognition, and again, how do I put this? I think like, for example, I volunteered and got involved with the Commonwealth Association of Architects to help them rewrite their criteria and their processes of validating schools of architecture, because I think it is important to raise the level of education and across the world, across the Commonwealth, and so any discussions about standards, it has to be about actually how do we help different countries and different schools within those countries raise what they're doing to the point where it's recognised by the RIBA. It can't be that we have different standards across the world, and so how we can support schools. I appreciate there's issues around budgets and staffing and software and facilities and so on, and we have to find ways of giving suggestions of how that can be well, not resolved. Well, resolved would be one, but minimized would be another. So as I said, we get approaches from time to time about recognizing different qualifications, and it has to be on a basis of being the same. Or interestingly, I was involved with I've spent 2 hours today in a meeting with the Architects Registration Board, and we're in a similar situation at a UK level, talking to other countries and their approach there. And and again, it gives you an illustration of that we're literally, for those that know, RIBA and ARB are just round the corner from each other. And this idea of we have to be in step with them, so that what ARB are looking at is they will negotiate quickly with countries where their standards and their registration processes are very similar, if not identical or better. And then they're looking at ways to other countries. It would be a case of how do they top up and compensate for differences. And I suppose that's a way forward with Kenya as well, if that's the case. So it's something I think we need to talk about, but and understand both positions of RIBA and Kenya.
Thank you. Next question from Anonymous. I think this is a 2-part question. The question is, how can RIBA help others if there are problems in their design? And from the same person, and how can we support students to have design excellence as part of their work?
The first one, in terms of helping others in terms of their design, it's an interesting point. We have a number of our student representatives on RIBA Council, and they're going to be presenting at RIBA Council at the end of March. And it is this sort of how do we never mind about design, just how do we support students and how can we support students better? I think are the really big questions. I think the way ahead does that in terms of helping to make it clear to RIBA validated schools what is expected. I'm involved in helping to create a book called Publication, which should be available online rather than just buying it physically. Study architecture well, and that is about deciding which school to go to, how to make the most of actually studying at a school, what the resources are, what questions to ask, what to expect from staff in terms of information, how they should be conducting themselves in design reviews, etc. And that is, I think that's part of it. I think also creating networks, I think, is important, where in my experience, students learn as much from each other as they do from the staff within a School of Architecture. So how do we help students make contact with each other, create chat rooms? We're currently trialing a digital sort of space for RIBA chartered members. And if that goes well, it will be rolled out further. And I would like to think in my diagram, it also includes future architects. And that can be student forums, chat rooms, informal. I draw little cartoons of the digital equivalent of meeting under a tree and actually having a conversation about each other's work. And I think that's all part of building a community physically, as in a city or whatever, but also digitally, that can support each other to be better.
Thank you. We're now back to the climate change, and it's based on the recent interview given by Terry Farrell, where he commented that the RIBA did ignore the climate change warnings of the Rio summit some 28 years ago. The question is, what has changed, and why should we believe that things have changed at RIBA?
I've met Terry Farrell once, but I can't remember what happened way back in Rio. I think you could argue that it wasn't just architects. Well, saying that, let's just say the messages were there, and I would argue that the world has not just architects, but I think virtually everybody. And what has happened, I believe, is that what was seen as let's call it what cranks and weirdos were interested in has become mainstream. It is, everybody is thinking about it. You look at, for example, how the previous governor of the Bank of England is now operating within the UN in terms of ethical investment. It's just compared to, let's say, 25 years ago, it's a completely different world. We have everyone is thinking of things differently. I appreciate some people might not. I said today in a meeting that I believe probably UK volume house builders are, if you like, still got their head in the sand. And in terms of what's the evidence that the RIBA has changed, again, here we are talking about the way ahead, and one of the key themes in there is climate literacy. We are moving to the point where we've agreed the knowledge schedule for climate literacy for CPD and mandatory testing, and that will be rolled out. I've asked what is the timeline for that, and I would like to think it's next year. So, and in terms of, you look at the RIBA Journal, in terms of how things are analysed and talked about, again, we talk about what I haven't mentioned, the RIBA awards, for example. We've stopped. We're not having submissions this year in 2021. What we're doing this year is processing, in inverted commas, the awards for 2020. And next year, it means that the buildings that will be the projects submitted for RIBA awards will have 1 year of occupation. And again, very much part of occupation is about performance, and performance is about climate emergency, energy, and there's going to be much more detailed requirements in terms of submissions for RIBA awards. So if you needed evidence, I think I could give you quite a long list of how it's happening structurally at a very high level. Our new chair of board, Jack Pringle, he says that there are 3 main areas for him. One is addressing climate emergency. He was actually one of the co-founders of the Green Building Council in the UK. The next is around competency, and the third is around diversity and inclusion. So right at the top, you have the chair of board, and in terms of council, we, for example, we voted yes last December for the RIBA to establish a climate action hub to actually make sure that everything that we're doing is coordinated, because you know what, we've only got one chance to get this right, and we have to ensure that people look back on us and say that we were good ancestors, that we did when it came to our attention, we did everything that we could.
Thank you, Alan. We've got lots and lots of questions. I'm not sure we're going to get through them all, but there's a really nice question from Al-Shidiak Muhammad Zain. I hope I pronounced that correctly. What is your message to the students who are suffering from the pandemic and are studying architecture from their own homes?
My message is, well, I think that there is a real difficulty, and there's a real lack of equity when we get into situations like this, because those students who live at home and their homes have fantastic Wi-Fi, and they have a spare room where they can go and work, or they have an enormous dining table and they can just close the doors and work there, are in a much better position to students that don't. That maybe they have, there's numerous generations living in the same household where there isn't the spare table or the spare room, where there isn't good Wi-Fi and so on. That makes it extremely difficult. And I just hope that it is as short-lived as it can be, and that the students support each other, that they ask their schools of architecture to support themselves, support them as much as they can. If they have any connections with practice, how they can support them. It is difficult. I've written on this in the RIBA Journal. I think it's we need to find ways of making sure that this is a very short-lived impact on the career of future architects.
Thank you. And just going on from still from university, but from a professor now, Maged Youssef, Associate Professor at Beirut Arab University. In the recent era of pandemic, what is RIBA's vision to implement health considerations in the ILOs of architecture courses? Will health factor become a priority in generation of design ideas?
Simply, yes. The new criteria, which is currently, well, I'm trying to remember its exact status. It probably it's going to standards committee either last week or next week. I can't remember exactly, but in it, the requirement, I think that the change, the impact, health and well-being is seen, even pre-pandemic, was seen as the next sort of area that we must focus on. You know, climate emergency, health and well-being. I mentioned sort of environmental equity. That idea of everybody should, and spatial equity, that everybody should have the right towards certain levels of space and quality of light and quality of air and so on. And that all goes back into well-being. I think I mentioned as well about the Goldsmith Street. So you will find in the learning outcomes for expected within schools of architecture, this idea of health and well-being is written in there and will be expected, and the visiting boards will be asking about it and looking for evidence, as will external examiners when they go to look at schools to actually see the evidence of it being taught in the lecture room and being delivered through design projects in studio.
Thank you, Alan. Question from Sandy. The RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge is based primarily, and not necessarily incorrectly, on the analysis of UK metrics. How can members with careers in the MENA region find relevance to buy into this?
I think it's a very good question. I think what has been touched on here is, dare I say it, that yes, I will. On the one hand, the RIBA presents itself as a global institute, but actually it still is quite UK based as well. So I think it's a very good point. I know Gary Clark, who was one of the main authors, or should I say architects, of the climate challenge, and to take it beyond the UK, I think is really, really important. But it starts to touch on, the question starts to touch on exactly the same questions about the way ahead, is that how do you apply approaches, let's call it that, like the climate challenge, like the way ahead, in different parts of the world. So what is relevant and how you would describe it in detail in the UK would be different how it would be in the Middle East or in South Africa. It would be different again. So it's how do you have that sort of, how do you blend or maximize the sort of, let's call it core and generic with the very specific to different parts of the world. I will talk to Gary Clark about that, about the non-UKness of the climate challenge.
Yeah, but this is a very interesting question. Another interesting question, and very topical indeed, about women in architecture. Is RIBA going to do anything to support the women architects who, due to family reasons, have had to take a long break from work? Like women returners in the UK and Ireland, it's extremely difficult to re-enter the workforce as there are very little support or mentorship opportunities in UAE.
My immediate thoughts on that are that I think the RIBA Academy is a really good vehicle to actually help catch up. Because if you're away for 2 years, legislation or whatever length of time, it can be about legislation, how things have changed. I think, like for example, the Gulf chapter could be doing things to sort of almost like a sort of top up. Again, this becomes very, if you like, local. How do you, whilst you were away, this has happened, and I think a regional sort of top up or coming back to work would be that's created by the local chapter would be very, very helpful. And again, where there aren't chapters, those 18 members in Kenya, for example, again, if somebody goes off on leave, how do they come? How do you brief somebody to bring them back in again? I think there's also that's about knowledge, but I think also there's issues around, let's just call it workplace culture, and we're reviewing the chartered practice criteria and the code of practice to see in terms of how we can improve, because we can always improve on guidance towards how offices and practices are run and attitudes towards staff. I mentioned the chair of board, one of his 3 priorities is about diversity and inclusion, and it is about maintaining the women within the profession. Within the UK, I've made the point a number of times that what we have in the UK is we have our profession is approximately, give or take 1 or 2%, 50-50 on entering the UK profession, and up to the age of 35, it's about 50% as well. but it starts to drop off, which is, one might argue, it's the old guard. It's that sort of older, more male profile that's still there later on in the age profile. And it is about maintaining those women in the profession, and that will change the overall profile. And so those are my initial thoughts on that point.
Thank you. I think we're probably nearly at the end now, but we'll take a couple more questions. We've got loads. But another question here: will the proposed RIBA ongoing competence testing of chartered members reflect the practice needs of members based outside the UK, or will it only be relevant to practices within the UK?
Well, that's the very reason we're here talking, because yeah. I'd love somebody to email info@riba.org and say, how do we ensure and implement the way ahead for practices sitting in Dubai, for example? Because it goes back to that point where this isn't, how do we roll out the way ahead outside of the UK? Because we want to, we have thousands of members outside of the UK, and we're not wanting this to be something that is purely UK. Definitely not. So how do we do the international version of the way ahead, the Dubai version, the South Africa version, and so on? How do we make it relevant? There will be requirements for I don't like to use the word testing, but let's just use it, Alan. Testing of competencies. How would if you're sitting in South Africa, Dubai, Kenya, how would you want to be tested, for example? And that starts to get into real the nitty-gritty of it. And I think we need to have some guidance of how you think it should work. The general, I've done a series of the initial workshops on the way ahead across the UK, and nobody said no, it's a bad idea, but they said it's all going to be in the detail, Alan. How do we do this and how do we roll it out? So we're asking the questions, and we'd love for some responses back as to very specific. Maybe it's something that becomes a 20-minute, half-an-hour conversation at the Gulf chapter council meeting, for example, if such a meeting takes place, for example.
Thank you, Alan. And I think that segue to, I think it's going to have to be our final question of the day. What guidance does RIBA give to its members exporting services into countries regarding observers' local content policy and laws, as would create a moral obligation to transfer skills?
Having not been involved with it directly, I can't say exactly. My sense is that just in terms of the ethics of the RIBA, and one would like to think of all its members, is that you just don't try and land into a particular region, a particular country, without understanding and engaging with the practice and the culture of that particular country. I would imagine most practices would aim to collaborate with a local practice. And again, I'm remembering the conversation with the Nigerian Institute of Architects, and Femi Orasanya, who chairs Architects for Change. He's also one of the main directors of the HOK office in London, and he was and I was encouraging him to think of, for example, that in Africa, the time difference between London and many parts of Africa is very little, so that you could actually consider having an office elsewhere, and a satellite office, again with COVID and the way it was working and so on, that it's seen, so you can start to build connections between UK practices and practices from elsewhere that could really benefit both. And that again starts to lift the local levels of skill, potentially, if there is any lifting to be done, but also then starts to engage with the local skills of architecture. So I think there's a lot to be gained from partnerships like that. And if there's anything that anyone can think we could do to increase that, or put obviously we have to be careful that we're not the police in terms of our members, but we can in terms of their business practices, but we can give guidance and we can help them understand the benefits of doing certain things. So if the particular person who's asked that question wants to email me directly, ajones@riba.org, I'd be happy to have a conversation about that.
Thank you, Alan. And I think that nicely closed the session. We do have other questions, and for those we've not been able to answer, where relevant, we will come back to you by email if we can. If you're obviously anonymous, that would be quite difficult for us, but we will publish them as on our website. We have run out of time. As I say, we're collecting all the responses from today's session to share on our RIBA YouTube channel with a whole series of our other international regions as well. And I really would encourage you to continue submitting your responses to the email addresses and keep in contact with us. RIBA International is here to support you. So if you have any question, any support you require, please just do be in touch with us. So it just remains for me to thank you all for joining us today. I know for many of you it's already a weekend, being Friday in the Arab countries. Thank you for making time for us on your weekend. And also to the RIBA team for delivering this event, Alan for his thought-provoking presentations, and particularly to the audience for taking time to share your insights on this very important subject. I hope you've enjoyed the event, found it very valuable. I certainly have. Please, as I say, do get in touch, and please continue to talk to us on any aspects of discussion today or anything else. We're always happy to hear from our members. Until we meet, take care and stay safe. Thank you.